Today, we're jumping into one of the most brutal and yet surprisingly overlooked conflicts in history, the Paraguayan War. This was an absolutely devastating war. You had this small, landlocked country, Paraguay, in the middle of this huge modernization push, and suddenly, bam, they're facing a massive alliance of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And right at the heart of this entire struggle was control over the massive rivers of South America. Paraguay's very survival hinged on answering one almost impossible question.
Right? I mean, think about that. This wasn't some kind of thought experiment for Paraguay. This was their reality. Their entire strategy, their ability to even exist as a nation, came down to figuring out how to overcome this insane technological gap on the water.
You see, the Paraná-Paraguay river system, that was the highway of this war. It was really the only way for the Allied forces, especially the incredibly powerful Brazilian Empire, to push troops and supplies deep into Paraguay's heartland. It's pretty simple, really. If you control the river, you control the invasion. If you lose the river, you lose the war.
So you've got Paraguay's president, Francisco Solano López. He was ambitious, to say the least. He decided to launch an invasion into Argentina. But he absolutely knew, this whole offensive was doomed if the Brazilian Navy could just sail up and down the Paraná River at will, cutting off all his forces. He had to do something drastic. He had to take a huge gamble to seize control of the water.
And that gamble? Well, it led to the first major naval showdown of the war, a battle at a little tributary called the Riachuelo, back on June 11, 1865. And the plan was as bold as it gets: destroy, or better yet capture, the entire Brazilian fleet in one single surprise attack.
Right before the battle, López put out this proclamation. You can just feel the intensity in that, right? This wasn't just about strategy for the Paraguayans. They truly believed they were on a holy mission. Morale was through the roof. His men literally promised him they would return with the Brazilian fleet in tow.
But morale can only get you so far when you're up against this. Just look at the raw numbers. Brazil had nearly twice the cannons, and more importantly, they had purpose-built warships. The Paraguayan fleet, on the other hand, was mostly made up of civilian passenger steamers that they just bolted cannons onto. Their engines were exposed, they weren't armored, they were never meant for combat.
So the Paraguayan plan had to be clever. They knew they couldn't win a straight-up gunfight. Their whole strategy was based on shock and awe. The idea was to hit them with a surprise attack at dawn, sail right past the anchored Brazilian ships, whip around, and then just ram and board them. The goal was to turn it into a hand-to-hand fight on the decks, where their numbers and fighting spirit could, hopefully, overcome Brazil's firepower.
But here's where it all goes wrong. The plan had a fatal flaw. Engine troubles, delays. The Paraguayan fleet didn't show up at dawn. They didn't even get there in the early morning. They were spotted around 11 a.m., giving the Brazilians hours to fire up their engines, pull up their anchors, and get ready for a fight. The one huge advantage Paraguay had, surprise, was just gone.
The result was an absolute catastrophe. In the chaotic fight that followed, the Brazilian warships just outmaneuvered and outgunned the converted Paraguayan steamers. 4 of Paraguay's ships were sunk or captured. That's nearly half their fleet. The rest were battered and had to retreat. Just like that, control of the river was lost, and Paraguay was thrown onto the defensive for the rest of the war.
Okay, so let's fast forward. 3 long, brutal years later, it's 1868, and the entire nature of the war has shifted. After the disaster at Riachuelo, Paraguay is stuck in this desperate defensive war on its own soil. And now, the Brazilians have a terrifying new weapon that's completely dominating the rivers.
I want you to meet the ironclad. Seriously, think of it as the tank of its day, but on the water. This thing was a floating fortress, covered in thick iron armor. Cannonballs that would have torn a wooden ship to splinters just bounced right off. To the Paraguayans, these things must have seemed absolutely invincible.
So these Brazilian ironclads just steamed right past Paraguay's remaining defenses, including their most important fortress at Humaitá. They set up a total blockade, cutting Humaitá off from everything. Paraguay was being slowly choked out, and President López knew he needed another desperate plan to try and break the siege.
Which brings us to their second attempt, an operation at a place called Taji that was born from pure, absolute desperation. The thinking was, if we can't beat the ironclads with our ships, maybe, just maybe, we can beat them with our men. And this just perfectly illustrates the sheer audacity of this plan. I mean, look at this. On one side, you have 2 state-of-the-art armored warships. On the other, 270 elite Paraguayan soldiers, called bogavantes, packed into 20 canoes, armed with nothing but grenades, spears, and hatchets.
This wasn't a naval battle anymore. It was a commando raid. A true David versus Goliath situation. The plan was straight out of a Special Forces playbook. These commandos, the bogavantes, which means lobsters, would paddle silently up to the ironclads at night, covering their canoes with floating plants for camouflage. Now, the ironclads had really low decks, so the idea was to swarm aboard, overwhelm the deck crew, and take the ships before those huge cannons could ever be fired.
And here's the craziest part. It almost worked. The Bogavantes successfully swarmed the decks of both ironclads, the Barroso and the Rio Grande. But the Brazilian crews were ready. They scrambled inside the armored casemates of the ships and just started firing out through the gun ports. So you had the Paraguayans trapped on the decks, unable to get in, while the Brazilian sailors fought back from inside their metal fortresses, and army units on the shore started opening fire.
The assault was beaten back, and the price of this gamble was just brutal. The Paraguayans had 74 casualties, either killed or captured. The Brazilians lost only 11 men. It was a heroic effort, but a bloody failure.
So Paraguay had tried twice, first with a conventional fleet, then with an unconventional commando raid. Both had failed. The blockade was unbreakable, and the consequences of that were now unavoidable.
That failed canoe attack really was the final nail in the coffin. With zero hope of breaking the blockade, the defenders of the great fortress of Humaitá had no choice but to abandon it, and that was the beginning of the end. Once the river was totally lost, the Allied armies could march deep into Paraguay, leading to the near-total destruction of the country.
In the end, President López himself was cornered and killed. His supposed last words really capture the absolute totality of the defeat. Yo muero con mi patria. I die with my country. For him and for so many Paraguayans, his own death and the death of his nation had become one and the same.
From that massive fleet action at Riachuelo to the desperate canoe raid at Taguí, Paraguay's fight for its rivers was an unbelievable story of bravery against truly impossible odds. But it leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? When you are fighting for your very survival, where is the line between a heroic gamble and just a futile sacrifice?